special guest, so would you please give yourself a round of applause, please? But since it's in the program, I'd like to call upon Dr. Albert Bacdayan. Raised among the Igorots, Bacdayan came to the country as a student in 1960. For 25 years, he taught at the University of Kentucky, chairing the anthropology department before retiring in 1989. He lives in Oakland, Connecticut, and is a frequent visitor to Delano to conduct interviews, raising the Filipinos' contribution to Delano and to the labor movement. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Albert Bacdayan.
I want to thank Roger and the organizers of this affair for inviting me to come to enjoy this moment with you. It's truly a historical moment, and my hope is that it will continue for time to come, and it will be another Filipino tradition here in Delano. Without too much ado, I will go to my very long speech, like I said. All right. With the indulgence of the hands and minds that wrote the program, I'm going to modify the topic a little bit. The topic is the oldest or earliest Filipinos in Delano. I want to modify that to include a discussion of the presence and influence of the Filipinos in Delano and how they came to be. Now you will see that in this shift there is going to be discussion not only of the earliest Filipinos but also of the process, the aspects of the chronology or the development of the Filipino presence. I'd like to start by a short summation of what I think is the Filipino influence and the Filipino presence in Delano. First, the Filipino weekend. I put as number one the fact that the Philippine weekend is now one of the three, is one of the trinity of Delano, of the Delano social calendar annually. This was preceded by a lot of other events in the course of the Filipino presence in Delano, and I will mention them very rapidly. First of all, the arrival of Romulo here, Carlos P. Romulo, in the spring of 1944. This was the war, as you recall, and it galvanized the Filipino community here and the city as well. So that there was a sort of a parade. The key to the city was given by the city officials in Delano to Carlos P. Romulo, which was the first time, I would think, that a Filipino ever received the key to the city. There was also then the Manila Day Parade during the in February 1945, after the liberation of the city of Manila. That was a big parade from what I read in the papers. Several cows were donated by some very wealthy citizens of Delano and the Filipinos, as well as the community at large, had a good time that day. I'm sure there are some of you here, and I think maybe Mary Tabuyo is one of those who remember that event. Then, Then there is the, or there was the coming of Mrs. Quezon, I think, of the Filipinos. Then there is the Agbayani village in 40 acres. I mean, what does that stand for? It stands, again, for the role that the Filipinos played in the struggle for economic justice that has been covered already. Now, politically, Larry Itliong's run, though unsuccessful in 1966, had a silver lining. It was followed very soon by the run of Leonard P. Velasco for City Council, and as you all know, that led to a string of victories as well as string of terms as city mayor of Delano. It was followed later on by successful runs for the office by Tessie Santiago. I don't know if she is here. Okay. Who became mayor, and of Napoleon Madrid, who was just speaking here. So, in short, who is going to say that the Filipinos do not have a presence in Delano, and that presence, actually, if one lists it down, is quite impressive, especially if one considers the fact that the start of the Filipinos here in Delano had been inauspicious. It was a poor start in the sense that the Filipinos who came here were men looking for jobs, and Delano was one of their way stations in their English search for jobs following the season of the crop in California agriculture, which is one reason why it is very hard for a historian or an anthropologist like me to really pin down when the Filipinos first came to Delano, and in fact who was the first and therefore earliest Filipino to come to Delano. Now, before we get to that, there was a fever to come to the United States that soon developed, a fever in the Philippines to come to the United States that soon developed after the start of the American colonial administration in the Philippines. What accounted for that fever? What accounted for that was first the work of the Thomasites. The Thomasites were the predecessors of the American Peace Corps. There were more than 1,000 American teachers recruited from universities across the United States to go to the Philippines to start the Philippine public school system. Well, you can imagine what happened in the schools. They were talking about the ideals of American society, you know, equality, opportunity for everybody, and so forth. Then, soon after the takeover in the Philippines, the United States inaugurated what has come to be known as the Pensionado Students Program, whereby well-selected Filipino students were sent at government expense to come to the United States to study American life ways and absorb American knowledge in universities and colleges to take them back to the United States. They did very well, and when they went back to the United States, to the Philippines, they took up the opportunities that they saw in the United States, which affirmed what the people learned from the Thomasites. Then there was also the PR, that's what I'm calling it, PR work individually and collectively of the Americans in the Philippines. They were the new masters, colonial masters in the Philippines. And in their dealings with the people, they were perceived to be quite different from the Spaniards. They talked to the Filipinos. A lot of them were racists, to be sure, but they also embodied many of the ideals of America. So the end result was everybody wanted to come to America, and the appeal was especially strong to the poor people, the poor peasants of the country, which was a big part of the population. And when men, and so the idea then was for families to send their members to the United States to partake of this opportunity to make money and go back to the Philippines to raise the economic and social status of their families. Okay, so so they came. The young men of the Philippines came full of dreams, and when they came, it was a nightmare. There were no jobs. The equality that they had heard in the Philippines was not there, and in fact there was no freedom of movement at all. The Manoms who came to Delano had that kind of background. Okay, so during the 1920s, there were thousands of Filipino young men milling all over California looking for jobs, and they couldn't find any. What happened in Delano was a godsend to the Filipinos, and what happened in Delano was the beginning of the table grape industry, and that was in 1923 when Anton Karatan of Yugoslavian descent came to Delano to operate a ranch, and was followed very closely thereafter by his brother as well as other Yugoslavian. There's an anachronistic term now because Yugoslavia doesn't exist as a country, but you know what I mean, you know, Slovenia, Moldova, Croatia, and all that. And so within a short time, there were jobs for Filipinos here in Delano, in the vineyards. And so Filipinos came to Delano. For the Filipinos, the vines, grapevines, truly tied. It was the grapevines that tied them to Delano, and they stayed, and that was the start of the Filipino community. All right. So speaking of Delano now, in terms of becoming of the Filipinos, to get to the United States Census, in 1920, the United States Census did not enumerate a single Filipino in Delano. Okay? In 1930, as you know, the census is done every 10 years. There were 10 Filipinos enumerated. I couldn't read the Xerox, the return that was sent to me by a friend at the University of Chicago who was doing the research, but the only thing I could figure out was that one of them was Tubilieha. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Constancio Tubilieha was among the very earliest leaders of the Filipinos here in Delano. Okay? So, the coming of the Filipinos to Delano must have been between 1920 and 1930. Now, I interviewed Cecil Dyer of the Delano Historical Society. Cecil Dyer told me that the local Delanoans, we first became aware of Filipinos in 1923 when a group of Filipino workers were spotted by the locals working at a ranch in Pixley. Bacdayan further told me that in 1925, Filipino workers were seen working close to, in ranches close to the town. And in that same year, 1925, Filipinos were frequently walking along the streets of Delano. Now you can imagine what that was, you know, Delano was a different world at that time. It was a highly segregated place. It was dangerous for people from the west side to go to the east side, for instance. So the Filipinos really caught the attention of the locals. Okay, this was corroborated by my interviews and discussions with Mr. Pablo Paca told me. Because Paca came in 1924, and according to Paca, he did not see any other Filipino here in Delano, not in any farm around or even in town. I sort of doubt that, but Paca was most emphatic about that. Okay, now, when Roy Arroyo, Venerable Roy Arroyo, a good friend of mine, came in 1927, he told me that he found and met a lot of Filipinos, and that these Filipinos were working in ranches, small, newly started ranches, all over Delano. I said, well, how many do you think were there? He said, well, maybe in the summer, the first time around, maybe 150. And, but of course, after the grape picking, they would leave. Okay, so Filipinos came then at, anywhere really around between 1923, 1924, 25, 26. Well, certainly 24 because Paca was here, and certainly 27 because Arroyo came here, and 1928 Frank Fernando moved here with his family from the Bay Area. Okay, so things started moving, and in 1932, for instance, the Teros, Pastor Tero and family moved here, and other families moved in. Paca himself moved from somewhere to the city of Delano, and also that year Escalona came to Delano and established a store called the Three Stars Fish and Sundry Stores, or something like that, which added to Filipino business that was already here, which was the Luna Mercantile, established by Bigote. Thank you, John Espinosa. Bigote, who started it. And it added to another business, the barber shop by Barkis, which, according to Roy, was established in 1926. So there were already three. By 1932, there were three Filipino businesses, all right? And very soon, the Bumatay family moved to Delano. That was in 1938. They established a business in Chinatown. And the good thing with the Bumatays, as with the Teros, is that these were complete families with several children. And so the Bumatays and the Teros and the Fernandos were among the earliest Filipinos growing in Delano. In 1933, the Filipinos in town, Escalona, Tobileja, and Roy Arroyo, already started talking about, my God, we are getting more and more here. Let's really do something to unite us. Let us establish a community. So the Filipino youth Protective Association was established in 1933. Okay. This song gave way to the organization at the urging of the Philippine government in 1938 of the Filipino community, Kern and Tulare counties. So, in 1945, because of developing competition between groups among the Filipinos, this split, and there were two Filipino communities, Filipino community of Kern and Tulare counties, and the Filipino Homeowners and Taxpayers Association, the association that first built this house under whose roof we are settled right here. This was built, completed in 1951, and it was dedicated that same year. I forgot the month and date, but there was a plaque here at one time that gave that by Carlos P. Romulo, who was the ambassador. Okay, who was the ambassador to the United Nations of the Philippines. So a lot of history has taken place in this hall. Now, the desire for community. Now, what was that? I mean, there was a strong desire for community. I have a theory about it, and I think the theory is that the Filipinos, of course, in terms of the stark facts that they were heavily discriminated against, there was nothing really to protect them except themselves. That's why they organized the so-called Filipino Youth Protective Association. They need to coalesce together as a group. But there was another one. There are three Filipino values I'd like to recall for you, if you still remember them. One is the Kababayan spirit, Filipino. Two Filipinos would meet somewhere and somebody say, "Uy, Kababayan!" Okay? A Kababayan means countryman or people who come from the same village. Now, the Kababayan spirit urges that Filipinos stay together, support each other, stick with each other. Okay, there's another Filipino value, it's called the pakikisama. And the pakikisama is a value that says that Filipinos should get along, not only with themselves, but with other people that they might meet in the community. Okay, there's the other value that of hiya, shame. Hiya, if you do not do this, you are kahihiya, you are shameful. So, I think this were urging the Filipinos really to stick together and be together as a community. So because of this, a strong community was established, and I would like now to conclude really by talking about the fact that what was happening in the Filipino diaspora community, so to speak, was influenced by Philippine history, that is to say the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Philippines, which made the Philippine government for the first time really care for the poor workers, who are abroad in the United States. And that's why they sent somebody to be Commissioner of Labor by the name of Verona, who came here in 1938, got the leaders here in Delano and said, you've got to organize to be a Filipino community. Okay? That was one. And then, of course, there was the Second World War that broke out at the end of 1941. Now, that was a godsend for Filipinos, because Filipinos were recruited to the United States Army. It looks to me like the one prize for enlistment in the American Army, and being successfully inducted was citizenship or a good prospect of citizenship, even the ability to marry Caucasians, which at that time was prevented by the anti-miscegenation law. Okay, so this helped, because with the eradication of the anti-miscegenation law, the fact that property was beyond the ability of Filipinos to purchase was already removed. It improved the economic situation of the Filipinos. So, to make this story short, the Filipinos, for cultural reasons, historical reasons, and others, have come a long way in Delano as well as in the United States. Now, are we going to lay about now and enjoy our victory, so to speak, our laurels? In my humble opinion, we shouldn't. I think Filipinos should continue to move ahead, look forward. I think Filipinos should really push the idea of unity again and of education of their children. Jose Rizal was right. Education was a great leveler, and if Filipinos are pushed to do well in school, we are now fortunate that the climate in this country is such that the color of your skin is no longer a barrier to the amount of education you can get. And so every parent, by example as well as preaching if need be, maybe with the force of the stick, shall we say, should go ask their children to go to school and work hard. Not only that, I think I see a vision for this Filipino community hall to be a vehicle for the development of Filipino pride. And Mr. Madrid is not here, but I think very creative programming in the Filipino program could bring out the best in Filipino youth and propel them, encourage them to do the best they can. And the notion really should be like Jose Rizal, you go to school not for your own benefit necessarily, but for the benefit of your community, in this case, your ethnic group and your community, Delano as a whole, or your country, the United States. And don't forget the Philippines. So, let us use the facilities of the Filipino community hall now. It is no longer a sectarian building, it's a building that belongs to the Filipino people as a whole. Let us use it as a vehicle for developing Filipino pride. And if we have Filipino pride, we are going to prevail against any kind of adversaries that is thrown our way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doc. As you can tell, Doc is a man of a few words, but actually he's a wealth of information, a wealth of history. Doc is working on publishing the history of the Delano and particularly the Delano Filipino community and our plight. So we thank Doc, and we're honored by your presence again. Doc Bacdayan, please. I think I want to